Welcome back, everybody, to A-Level Politics, Political Ideas for the AQA specification. This lesson is going to move on to the third major political idea that is of relevance for our studies in A-Level Political Ideas, which is, of course, socialism. We'll take an introduction to socialism in this video, looking at what it is, some of its origins, and then we will start to unpack the various different elements of socialism as lessons go on. So we're moving away from the study of conservatism and liberalism and starting to talk about socialism. Now, socialism is an incredibly broad political, sociological, economic, and philosophical movement. It has a lot of literature attached to it. It also has a lot of connections and overlaps with other elements of political ideology. So socialism and communism, very, very similar, but also socialism and anarchism being quite similar as well, having certain interesting elements that are attached and across each other there. We can, if we were to try and find some common thread among socialist ideas, we would probably describe it as being historically and historically situated as being defined as an opposition to capitalism in its various different forms. And this is through the various different modes of analysis. Not only is it economically opposed to capitalism, but also on the basis of philosophy, sociology, and politics as well. A lot of socialists believe that capitalism permeates a lot of these other ideas, and so an opposition to capitalism cannot just be an opposition through that of economic modalities. It has to also think about it through the lens of sociology, philosophy, and politics. Now, generally speaking, socialism strives for a level of social equality. However, the idea of egalitarianism isn't something that is quite debated within socialist movements. Marx himself, for example, was not an egalitarian. And this is a position that really leads to a number of different outcomes. It is a normative position that things ought to be different fundamentally, that in opposition to capitalism, there ought to be an equal distribution of wealth, income, and class within society. This is a little bit simplistic, overly simplistic in terms of a definition of socialism. I'm sure there'll be socialists in my comment section disagreeing with everything that I say. But fundamentally, this opposition to capitalism involves a strict response to the ownership of the means of production, fundamentally. This is how we really derive at some of the ideas of socialism under Marx. We'll get to this in later on in this lesson and in a few lessons' time. But fundamentally, the idea of equal distribution of wealth, income, and class within society comes at the behest of the revolution of the socialist revolution, which takes over where we see a proletarian dictatorship over the means of production. I'll get to what all of this means in future lessons' time, but this is really something that comes as a result of socialism as well. In terms of the origins of socialism, it actually didn't originate with Karl Marx specifically, and oddly, as you would be mistaken to believe. The origins of socialism can be found in the 1800s. We have reactions to the Enlightenments during the 1800s, as well as growing issues in relation to the development of this new mode of capitalism. We start to see the Industrial Revolution take place, the end of the 1700s into the 1800s, and we start to see the result of this being that people start to look a little bit more critically at this new mode of capitalism. The first people to use the word socialist were people by the name of Charles Fourier and Robert Owen. These were sometimes known as the utopian socialists. They are not the kind of socialism that we are going to be studying in this series, given that the word socialism is co-opted by the likes of Marx and Engels, who then take it on, and it becomes a completely different meaning. So the utopian socialists simply wanted to apply Enlightenment ideas to issues relating to wealth inequality and poverty, i.e. distribution of wealth and fundamentally a tackling against that of poverty. According to Owens, the conditions of capitalism creates lives of misery and conditions that are unworthy of rational beings. So there is agreement among people like Fourier and Owens, and people like Marx and Engels in relation to the conditions of capitalism, what capitalism brings and the kinds of things that capitalism does. It leaves misery and leaves people in conditions that are unworthy of rational beings. Marx would also probably contend that this is also true in his conception of socialism. But Marx is not a utopian socialist. He was very critical of the utopian forms of socialism. According to Marx and Engels, socialism is a state of society that would be naturally and inevitably something that replaces capitalism. And this is something that should be noted early on here. When we think about socialism and its contrast to communism, there's actually very little delineation that is made in the writings of Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels doesn't really delineate between socialism and communism in their writings. Instead, the use of the word socialism, according to Marx, is in critical response to the utopian socialists. So socialism and communism, according to Marx, are sort of one in the same thing. So when we suggest that communism is something different to socialism is actually not true, at least in terms of Marx and Engels' writings. Obviously, subsequent to this, writings from other philosophers over years have, of course, maybe added some more conversation to this debate and led to a little bit more back and forth and a little bit more potential delineation between socialism and communism. But at least Marx and Engels themselves, they did not delineate between the two. We'll get to what Marx and Engels believes about socialism in the next lesson, but for now just note that the socialism that we are thinking about is an opposition to capitalism, but it is not the kind of socialism that existed in the writings of people like Charles Fourier and Robert Owen, the people who would be described as the utopian socialists today.